To say that Mrs. Gina Rinehart is the perfect honoree for the Atlas Society's 2024 Lifetime Achievement Award is, if anything, an understatement in the extreme. She is Dagny Taggart and Francisco d'Anconia rolled into one and then some. Of course, all of you in the room know her story. Growing up on a sheep and cattle farm in the remote and rugged region of Pilbara in northwest Australia, she was 13 when she first read and fell in love with the literature of Ayn Rand. Obviously, our shared admiration for Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged was the genesis of this interview. Your family also were among the first white settlers in northwestern Australia. I can just imagine what kind of conditions that they had to brave. So how did they come to go there, and what was life like for them?
They voyaged up in this little boat, 167 tons, called the Sea Ripple. There were 3 Hancock family members on board. Fanny Hancock, who was, I'm not sure, 16 or 17. Her sister Emma, who was not much older, she was expecting, and she had a husband as well on board. Her name was Hancock initially, but then it became Withnell. And then John Hancock. So the Hancocks and some Withnell members voyaged up, and on the way their boat ran into trouble, their wooden boat. So it got holes in it and started to leak and lopside. So they lost half their stock. They lost a lot of their possessions and supplies. And they limped into what became, well, they developed the port of Cossack. Now, just arriving there didn't mean that there was fresh water. They had to walk in 14 miles to find inland to find fresh water. They carried what possessions they could, then later on came back for a few more. They established the first town when they found the fresh water in a creek near Roban. That was called Roban. And they established the first stations, meaning big ranches up north there, and therefore the first agricultural industry. Of course, when they landed there, there was no house to go to. There were no yards made for their cattle. There were certainly no shops, hairdressers, medical treatments, dentists, vets, anything. They really had to make do or do without. And there was a hell of a lot of the latter, do without. And their lives were tough. Every day was tough. They respected the Sabbath, meaning the Sunday. And on those days, as a family, they would read the Bible together for 2 hours. And that was their form of, dare I say it, break, entertainment. It was not an easy life. Dad had a single-engine aircraft. I was allowed to pump the fuel out of the 44-gallon drum. And, we'd have the windmills to look after. If those windmills weren't working, your stock died. They can't go without water. No human can go without water. So keeping those windmills okay was great. So Dad would be the one who actually knew what he was doing. He'd skedaddle up the windmill, fix it if there was something wrong up at the top, and I'd have to bring up the tools. So my father was actually quite renowned for very little patience. So if I got it wrong, I'd have to scuttle down again and get the next one. In those days, there was no safety chain, there was no helmet, nothing. And I was doing this from 4 years onwards. I was loved dearly, but I wasn't mollycoddled. Yeah, so I learnt it was up to me to get the steps right. It was up to me to hang on, even though I also had a tool in the hand. That sort of practical, common sense background has probably helped me a lot.
Responsibility, it sounds like
responsibility.
You were raised with the adage, if it's to be, it's up to me. And it was that resilience that I'm sure helps to keep you going through the challenges that you continued to face through business.
Even back then, I mean, of course, the pioneers had it far worse. But even back then, I mean, in my dad's time, for instance, the ship would come up twice a year with supplies. So even in my time, if you looked at the tin of flour, there'd be weevils in it. So our lovely lady manager, she would make these apple pies, and they'd be all speckle, 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 with all the insects touring the flour. Every night the insects would be going around the lights. We'd only have electricity on twice a day.
It wasn't until you were 13 that you first discovered Ayn Rand.
Yes.
And was that Atlas Shrugged? And
it was Atlas Shrugged. That the values that were in that book, I haven't shied from ever since. I think they definitely helped to give me the certain values that I believe in. Yeah.
So in writing Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand said she, quote, set out to show the world how desperately it needs prime movers and how viciously it treats them. And hypothetically, she also wanted to show what would happen in a world without them. So given how viciously and relentlessly the Australian mining industry and you personally are maligned by the press, environmental activists, etc., have you ever fantasized about going Galt, about just shrugging, or even going Francisco, Franconia, and leaving the detractors to their own devices?
Various government policies have basically forced people to take that route in our country. I understand, for instance, in the dairy industry about 25 years ago, there were about 420 dairy farmers in our state. But nowadays there's 120. All these government regulations are making it very difficult to work at all.
425 dairy families down to 120. This is
in 25 years.
In 25 years, Atlas Shrugged in action.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, you know, they love to talk about sustainable this and sustainable that.
I don't like that word sustainable.
But, you know, I think we should think about applying it to what is sustainable for business. Is that the person that you were talking about who was getting up at 4 a.m. and staying up till 2 at night to do the paperwork? I mean, that's not a sustainable situation.
That's correct.
We need to think about what is sustainable for business and also for the revenues that it brings in for necessary state.
We are the engine room of this country, our mining industry. It creates more revenue than every single other industry added together, to give you a bit of perspective. And what they don't understand with their legislation, their rules and regulations, is that you've got to keep opening new mines. Once you've mined one out, it doesn't fall from the sky and replenish itself. You've actually got to open new mines or even mine extensions to be able to keep this beautiful revenue stream going that supports our defence, our police, our nurses, our hospitals, and you name it. And this is the bit that they just don't get. What they do has consequences. You know, this word common sense, 2 words, people are losing this. They just don't get what they're doing has consequences. This is already showing investment in Australia is going that way, downwards. It is showing our living standards are already going this way. You will see so many small exploration companies in our country are actually going offshore because small businesses have exactly the same government tapes, regulations to get through as every other size of business. But for small business to cope with it,
they don't have the huge accounting departments, the huge legal departments.
You're so right. The floors of staff looking after this, they've got it. I mean, it's taking us about 17 years now to get a mine developed in Australia. It is approximately 17 years. It is just so much government tape.
So one of the key messages of Atlas Shrugged is reason versus anti-reason. It's underscored in the names that Ayn Rand gives the 3 sections of the book. non-contradiction, either or, and A is A. And when Ayn Rand was asked to colloquially describe objectivism, epistemology of reason, she said, you can't have your cake and eat it too. And yet, that seems precisely what too many Australians and representatives in government want to do. They want to eat the cake of all of the benefits that are paid for by mining revenues and taxes, and yet they don't want the cake, mining, to exist.
Our curriculum at our schools, it is lowering the areas of rationale and logic. It is a lot more on propaganda. Probably close to a third of our curriculum, if not more, is woke. It is anti-Australia. It is climate change, those sorts of areas. And I think our students are missing out. As was said in the conference today, our standards of education, reading, writing, etc., are going down. It's getting filled with this stuff instead. This is what's happening over here. And I'm not just referring to Australia. I'm sure it's in your own country, but of course you can speak better on that than I can.
So you have quoted Ayn Rand's warning to describe what you see as the dangerous path that Australia is pursuing. Quote, we are fast approaching the stage of the ultimate inversion, the stage where the government is free to do anything it pleases, while the citizens may act only by permission.
I think I've spoken on them quite a little bit, but we also had this legislation that nearly came in West Australia. There was a lot of opposition to it, and thank goodness although it was passed by Parliament, it was decided to withdraw it. But it's more than the industries that I've been talking about. This actually affects people directly, and I'll give you one tiny example. That particular legislation was going to make it very, very difficult to do anything from about 4 kilograms of soil disturbance. So not just mining companies were thinking this is bad news, agriculture, etc., but individuals who'd owned a block of land where they wanted to build the home of their dreams, it takes more than 4 kilograms of soil to disturb it. So you'd have to get all these studies done, you'd have to get negotiate approvals, which may or may not be forthcoming. What I'm saying about it, when the government brings in these sorts of draconian, dangerous legislations, yes, it hits the mining companies, yes, it hits agriculture, yes, it hits tourism, yes, it hits defence, yes, it hits infrastructure, but it also reaches down to mums and dads.
I remember when I worked for about a dozen years for David Murdoch, no relationship to Rupert Murdoch. He's the billionaire owner of Dole Food Company and also Diversified Holdings. And I remember there was some mid-level sales guy who looked at Mr. Murdoch and he said, he just won the lottery. And I said, well, look at that lottery that he won in life. He was born dyslexic. His father abandoned him and his mother when he was just a boy. At 12, he had to leave home to go find various odd jobs. He ended up homeless after being discharged from the Army.
Wow.
2 bankruptcies. I think the same lottery smear is often tried to be applied to you because it was your father who originally founded the Hancock Prospecting. And so maybe mediocrities may like to feel better about themselves by, imagining that you just sort of walked into this finely tuned business, but that's not exactly what you found. That's not what happened.
I think there's a tall poppy syndrome if you're not left. I mean, you'll look at our tall poppies who are left, they're hardly touched, they're not scathed. It's the ones who stand up for the rights of the individual, the responsibilities of the individual, the ones that might be pro-free enterprise. They're the ones that are cut down, you know, when they speak out, for instance, or, you know, develop companies. You know, my father did some amazing things, but the end of his life was actually very sad. And so when I took over the company in 1992, it was a situation where the checks were getting written, bumped in the drawers, because there wasn't any money. There is a lot of work, you know, and lots of the work is not what you want to do.
No.
You know, I mean, this government exactly. This government regulation business is
tedious.
Yeah, and such a non-productive waste of your time. And there's a lot of your time is spent on that.
On the paperwork. And I have to think that being pioneers, that at some point that kind of gets passed down, if not really in the DNA, but at least in the cultural DNA.
A lot of our youth get depressed, mental illnesses over what back then you wouldn't even think was a mental illness. I wish the pioneers were more taught in our schools for a lot of reasons, so that we can be proud of our country. We can be proud of their contribution. We have some basis of our foundations in this country. But I wish their families would also, be they their grandparents, be they parents, would also try and tell their children and grandchildren about this.
These stories, this incredible cultural heritage. And I think that having that context, as you said, would really help to counter some of the resentment, the entitlement, the envy, with gratitude, really, for what we have.
Somebody, you know, to be proud of our ancestors. My goodness, they deserve our pride.
You are the largest individual donor to Olympic sport in Australian history, in sports like swimming. How did sport become such a personal passion for you?
Partly, I guess, because I had children who had asthma, and I understood that swimming was very good for children with asthma. So I guess I got in on the first stage area that way. Don't like to see kids in the streets as you do, you know, drunk, the eye makeup strewn everywhere, the short skirts. You know, when I go to swimming awards, as I do, you know, to see these fresh-faced kids with lovely smiles, proud of what they're doing, there's so much more to it at a person level. And then when you get up to the ones who really excel, the Olympians, they're representing our country. And we did so well. You know, it lifts the morale in our country, how well we did. Great role models and great young ambassadors for our country.
Well, there's no greater role model in my book, and I think if Ayn Rand was around, she certainly would agree, than Mrs. Gina Rinehart. I'm so proud to have you as our 2024 honoree. Thank you for your example. Thank you for all you do to advance our shared ideals, and thank you for what you're doing to help save Western civilization and Australia. Thank you so much.
You know, I only do this as a part-time thing. I would like to thank your organization, because you are doing this full-time. And I really think without somebody like you and your organization, I think you'd have had socialism in your country and all the disbenefits socialism brings a long time ago.
Well, as Ayn Rand said, when asked whether or not Atlas Shrugged was somehow prophecy of things coming true, she said, Atlas Shrugged is not a prophecy of unavoidable destruction, but a testament to man's power to avoid it if he chooses to change course. So that's what we're doing at the Atlas Society, trying to get young people to choose to change course. And so far, I think we're doing okay. At the Atlas Society, we've set out to engage 1 billion young minds with the ideas of Ayn Rand. You can help by tapping that subscribe button, and don't forget to give this video a like below.